I just continuously drew. I make it a practice to draw continuously. Anytime I had free time, could be my fellow GIs. Well, that was on shipboard. I think this was on the return trip home because we were allowed on the decks because we were confined below deck, for security reasons. Oh, they were interested in the soldiers and, inquisitive and very, very courteous. Well, when I was a student in Paris in 1948, 47 and 48, I was told that you could make etchings by scratching into metal. I lived in an apartment in Paris in an industrial section, and out my window there were many factories, and so I played with these kinds of structures. And after I had done the dry points and I finally learned how to make etchings, I took some of the dry points and put other processes into them, such as aquatint. There were professional printers that were available, and I just turned the plates to them and they gave me the finished products. I had 1 year remaining on the GI Bill, and I also had a Fulbright to study painting in Paris. And this was in 1950. And that was the year that Stanley Hayter came back from New York City after being there for 10 years during the war years. He taught printmaking where you use the metal plate as a piece of low-relief sculpture. And I had an image of 3 politicians, and I used the acid to try to signify the corruption that politics unfortunately signifies. The Museum of Modern Art had an exhibition, Young American Printmakers, and this was chosen to be in the show and the tour. I was interested in the mother and child theme, having become a father. At that time, I was still very much interested in Picasso. I cut the block very freely, and my chief influence was the Italian primitive school, where they had the mother and child image as a dominating shape within the long rectangle. I was just having fun getting away from the literal depiction to the more symbolic. I was doing several self-portraits because the model was always available.
And cheap.
And cheap, yeah. Again, I worked freely and I used collage elements from ongoing woodcuts that I had at the time. When Joe Stalin died, he was one of the mass murderers of the 20th century. And I made several drawings in preparation for making the woodcut. And I was particularly impressed by the AP photo in all the newspapers showing him in his casket. And I thought, the Shakespeare line, the evil that men do, looking back on the sketches, I wish I had kept the abstraction more as in that rather than in this. However, this, I feel, is a very successful image of a mass murderer laid to rest. Yeah, I thought green would be an appropriate color for death rather than just plain black and white. When the State of Israel was created, the Arab nations immediately went to war. Ben-Gurion, who was the first premier, said he would gladly give land in exchange for peace. However, his offer was refused, and the conflict, unfortunately, still goes on. However, I was impressed by his statement that the creation of Israel was a miracle, and any person who didn't believe in miracles was not being a realist. Hence the quote. There was a television program in which he was interviewed in the desert, and his face was constantly being attacked by flies, and he kept talking through the whole interview. Occasionally he would brush his hand across his face, but normally he would just keep the conversation going, and meanwhile I was feeling the flies on my face. Sigmund Freud. I became interested in his life, and when I do a portrait, I try to find out as much about the personal life of the person. And he had an amazingly difficult life, medically and politically. This proved to be one of my most popular prints. I immediately got a terrific amount of correspondence from both patients of psychoanalysis and mothers of psychiatrists and psychologists. And everyone wanted to know how well I knew Freud, my contemporary. This is about academic life. I had a friend over in the classics department, Clarence Forbes, and I would always ask him, Clarence, how do I put into Latin? But we are awfully big for midgets. And he said, give me a couple of days, and then he'd send me the correct Latin. Ut homunculi ita valdi magni. I like the symbol of the basset hound because it seemed to me an appropriate animal for academe. Short-legged, big ears to the ground, and very sad eyes. I had never heard the expression Mickey Mouse courses, and when I heard that expression, I appropriated that as a good symbol for academic garb. I was very fortunate to get a job teaching art at a great university. However, I was dismayed to find that politics intruded on the governance of the university. We had a lot of political difficulties, and so using the previous image of the blind leading the blind, I did a woodcut based on story without words. I use symbolic characters. The leader is obviously a horse's rear end, and he's being followed in a procession of the blind follower, the academic sheep whose credo is, whatever you do, I will follow. And then there is the crippled parrot who also says, whatever you say, I will also say. Along with Mickey Mouse courses, I've heard the expression cow college. And so I got the image of the stadium, the big cattle, and the academic shepherd. At one time, the newspapers had a special section, the women's section, and one was society page. And many of my images were derived from photos of tea parties. And I was impressed both with the hats and the women. I still am impressed by the women. Nikolai Gogol was a great 19th century Russian novelist. He wrote many letters to his mother, complaining about the treatment for tuberculosis, which finally killed him. He said he objected to the slimy creatures that were crawling over his face and across his mouth, trying to get up his nostril. And so I thought the leeches, the doctor, and Gogol, the patient, would make an image. One of my kids was making drawings, and I was thinking, if I appropriate that, it would be a good image for Gertrude. And so I did, and it's been a very, very successful print.
How did your kids feel about having their paintings or their images appropriated?
Well, they feel their work is far better. Yeah, no contest. It took a long time for the country to get around to granting full civil rights. And there was discrimination in the hiring practices. And so I had public service with the expression, we don't care if you're white or black so long as you're white, which is sad commentary. Not every day is a rosy day in the life of an artist. There were days when I felt that my head was on backwards. One of my kids happened to be making a drawing of astronauts. And I said, can I use that picture of yours? He says, sure, go ahead. And so I combined my image of a man with his head upside down together with my kid's drawing of the sky and the astronaut. Occasionally, when I was making a print, they would say, well, I think I can do it better, and I say, go ahead. And if you do, I'm going to use it. And it happened in a few cases. Amy Lowell has appeared in several of my prints. I am impressed with her poetry. She was a pioneer in creating a new form of poetry. She was a promoter of the early poems of both Robert Frost and Ezra Pound. She had a very short life, very full life. She was in constant pain, and to alleviate the pain, she smoked cigars. And she had a terrific sense of humor. Her last statement was that she had lived the almanac. She had lived her days. Each fall, the warfare begins. College football. Each fall, there is the dance. I use the symbolism of the coach as being Mars and the homecoming queen as Venus. The oval is the centerpiece of the Ohio State University. And each spring it's fun to walk across and see co-eds shedding their clothing and frisbees appearing. And so this is one of two versions for the first spring day on campus.
Have you ever been given a hard time for your depictions of women?
No. No.
I just
Some
wondered.
like them lean, some like them plump. Emerson was a crusty New Englander. And here again, the influence of Hayter's Studio 17 is very, very powerful. I happened to use a plate that was badly damaged, mocked up to begin with, and I had very little to do to establish the image. When my mother got to the time in her life when she had to go to a rest home, she said, here is my photo album. Anything you want, you take out, please. So I had always seen this picture of my paternal grandparent. Evidently, he was a widower, and it was a brown photograph. And when I took it out of the album, I discovered it had been a postcard. And it was written in Yiddish. The glue that attached the postcard to the page stuck to the image. Somebody at the post office had written 119 State Street, having translated that. I guess it was common during the great wave of immigration to have translators in the post office who could take a language, Russian, Polish, Armenian, Czech, German, and translate it to the American address. And I decided that together they would make a complete image. And I made it into a large-scale photo engraving. And it's become sort of a generic immigrant family photo. There are many events each day on campus, and not all of them have to do with academic subjects. I remember one day when Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, and Woody Hayes, the coach, cut the ribbon for McDonald's in the student union. I knew it was going to be an event. What triggered the transfer of McDonald's to the student union was when McDonald's opened across campus on High Street, all the students flocked there, and the university figured the wisest thing to do would be to provide that service within the university union, which they did. And at that time, it was the largest McDonald's in existence. So I came and watched the ceremony, and coming back afterwards across campus, I was inspired by the fact that there was a big hamburger in the sky, and there was one of my flying professors, and all up in the sky over the campus, a big event had been symbolized. The university began a letterpress program, and I was able to become a participant from its early beginnings. We produced broadsides, books, and this happened to be one called Picnic on the Battlefield by a Spanish writer and playwright called Fernando Arrabal. It's really a play about the Spanish Civil War, where the parents are so proud of their son being a soldier, they go out to the battlefield with him. And another soldier from the enemy line comes, and he's the identical twin of their own son. So they have a picnic on the battlefield, set up a portable phonograph, and unfortunately, the bombs start falling, and they're all blown apart. I have a few prints on the Reagan presidency. He's considered an American hero on the right. Having been an actor, he was an excellent communicator. And his idea was that welfare only helps the poor, and they are undeserving. His policies were not in the public interest, I did not believe. He heavily favored business. I had been enamored of the work of the Spanish painter Velázquez, who had painted the royal court, and at that time it was the custom of the court to import dwarfs. The court thought it was appropriate to have these dwarfs bring up their children. The court thought enough of one of their favorite dwarfs, Antonio, that they had the court painter Velázquez paint his portrait with one of the royal dogs. And so I thought it would be an appropriate statement on the Reagan presidency. We were ruled by a great communicator, but basically he was a dwarf. I tried to bring in the abstract elements of image making in the structure of my representational images. But I've also looked at outsider art and the work of the so-called insane and institutionalized people who express themselves very, very well in visual terms. And I got the inspiration to take the images, instead of using linear elements, tearing out my shapes and create images. And so this is one of those experiments where I use collage elements and just enough visual imagery and spots to get my notion that these were women, pictorial women. A lithograph of patriotic women. I just felt that it made a good image together with the flags. I've been influenced by the society pages, which no longer exist in newspapers. There used to be women's pages, society pages, where women's teas were documented, engagements, weddings, and so forth, installations of offices, of women's clubs. That no longer exists in newspapers. They exist now instead in city magazines and other periodicals. I did a series on the Holocaust. Being an American Jew and having been a soldier in combat, I had known about Hitler's policies towards the Jews well before we got into the war. I was anxious to become a soldier. So I did a series of 43 lithographs on the men who made Hitler's regime possible and who carried out his murderous policies. I read many books on the period, both pre-war Germany and the Nazi period. After 43 images, I felt that was enough. I had reached the level of my pain threshold. This was Passover, 1945. My cousin David was wounded severely on D-Day. His brother served also in the army. In 1945, people in the service were being discharged. I was discharged later that year, and both my parents were there, and the host, my Uncle Morris Cohen, and my younger brother, my cousins, were all there in the living room, and I made an image of that. I read a lot of history. I read a lot of biography. He was a visionary way ahead of his time, which was the late 18th and 19th century. He started the first public university in England. His will was eccentric, to say the least. He wanted his body to be dissected. He wanted that to be watched by his friends and associates. He wanted a death mask to be made of his face, and he also wanted that his clothing be put on an effigy figure, and that he be placed in a glass case, and every year at the trustees meeting at the University of London, he should be present. And he still is. Hurricane Katrina was one of the most severe in American history, and the government did not respond adequately. And at this date, New Orleans is still needing rehabilitation in many areas. The poorest sections of New Orleans were evacuated to the sports dome because there was no other facility, and whole families, and mainly African American families, and the old were brought there and not given adequate care. When Bush was elected, I was very disturbed. I felt the election was questionable, and it didn't seem to me that he had the character to be a president of the most powerful nation on earth. And so I started to collect newspaper articles. And in 2007, I had enough material so that I could start a series that I called Legacy, Bush 2000-2008. I started out by making collages, using some elements of newspaper accounts, the actual typography of the newspapers, plus an assortment of pictorial material I had assembled. And after I made the collages, generally on a 9.5 by 11, 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, I gave them to my friend, a computer wizard, who had a large printer, a 34-inch printer, and he was able to use the math to put the material into 4-foot by 4-foot format. After I got the enlarged collages back, I proceeded to work with pencils, paint, additional collage material. His legacy is the deaths that were caused by the war in Iraq, both the American casualties and the uncounted Iraqi civilian deaths.